Hi everyone, Jason from the Clearview Library District here, and tonight I'm excited to introduce to you a program called Rocky Mountain Tales of Survival. It's going to be presented and performed by an actor from Estes Park named Kurtis Kelly. He's going to tell you all about some of the adventures that early settlers of the Estes Park area had as they explored the mountains around them. If you have any questions about anything you hear in his performance, please just leave us a note in the comments and we'll make sure that Kurtis receives those and that you get an answer. If you want to find out more about the exciting things going on this summer at the Clearview Library District, please just visit our website, clearviewlibrary.org. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll hand you off to Kurtis Kelly now.
Hello everyone, welcome to this performance of Rocky Mountain Tales of Survival. My name is Kurtis Kelly and I'm honored to be your teller of tales for this session. We're going to hear tales of rescue, of determination, tales of people who found themselves lost on the Continental Divide in a blizzard, tales of people who've come face to face with dangerous wild animals in the mountains, tales for all ages. But before we begin, I want to thank the Clearview Library District for making this possible. The Clearview Library is celebrating the 2020 Summer Reading Program with the theme, Imagine Your Story. I love stories. I hope you love stories. I love reading stories, listening to stories. I believe that stories really help connect us as a people. We all love to gather and hear stories. I think stories help build empathy in us by allowing us to experience the world through other eyes and to walk in other footsteps. And I think stories take us on flights of adventure. They stir our imagination, they engage our creativity. So let's celebrate stories, and I hope you'll check out all the great things happening at the Clearview Library District this summer and all throughout the year. Now, I mentioned my name is Kurtis Kelly. I have been telling history stories here in northern Colorado for over 25 years, and often when I come and do a presentation, well, I step out as one single character and I stay in that character until the very end of the presentation, and then I step out of character. Well, this is a little bit different in that I am going to do a medley of stories today. I'm doing 5 stories, 4 different characters, all around the Tales of Survival theme, tales that occurred in these Rocky Mountains. And so I hope you'll enjoy this adventure that we're about to go on. Now, to get us started, our very first story comes from a gentleman named Joe Mills. Now, Joe was a writer and naturalist who came to these mountains and had wonderful adventures, built his cabin in the mountains, and later built a place called the Crags Lodge. And he even has a storied career in football. He was a quarterback for the Colorado Agricultural College, which later became Colorado State University. He was later one of the early football coaches for the University of Colorado in Boulder. So Joe has a great career. And in 1926, he published his memoir and stories in this book called A Mountain Boyhood. So our first story is called Off the Trail, from the chapter In a Mountain Boyhood. And we'll let Joe kind of explain why people might go off the trail and what dangers might await if they do. Well, there are a number of reasons why someone might go off the trail. Of course, lots of excursions in the mountains occur when people stay on trail and everything winds up happy. But when people go off the trail, well, that's when things can get a little interesting, if not dangerous. Now, there are at least 4 reasons why people might go off the trail. Now, one reason is they might get lost. Has this happened to you? You're walking in the mountains and you see a tree. Maybe you mark and you say, those 3 trees are going to be my guide. And you look and you say, but were those the same 3 trees I saw before? Or, you know, that rock looked like the one I made my turn on, but I'm not sure if it was this rock. Yeah, those markers can get us confused in our minds. Another reason people go off the trail is maybe they have something that frightens them. Maybe there was an animal that they saw and they need to take a different path to steer clear. Another reason people go off trail is, well, they might have an illness or an injury. And a fourth reason, of course, very common, is the ever-changing weather in Colorado. You can set out in the morning in a sky that is as beautiful and peaceful as a baby's smiling eyes. Well, later in the day can turn very, very quickly. My story of rescue, my story of helping someone who went off the trail, relates to the story of Miss Victoria Brom, who set out to be the first woman to climb solo Long's Peak. Now, Miss Brom had spent the summer at the Long's Peak Inn with myself and my older brother, Enos Mills, and Brother Enos had two bits of advice, two recommendations for Miss Brom if she was going to climb Long's Peak by herself. You see, many people climb Long's Peak, but usually in a guided party. Now, Enos said, there are two things you should do. One is climb all of the lower peaks first so that you build up your stamina and your strength and your confidence, and Miss Brom did that. And the second was to bring along his short-nosed collie of a dog, Scotch. Make sure to bring Scotch because Scotch is a great navigator. And if you don't want to go with another human, Scotch is the next best thing, if not even better. Scotch knows his way and he will keep an eye on those trails. So when Miss Brom set out, as she did on a beautiful September day, well, we called Scotch, and Scotch came a yipping, yip, 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 yip. He was ready to go on that excursion. And of course, we both said to Scotch, now Scotch, you look out for Miss Brom. You keep an eye on the trail. You remember the sights and the turns. Yip, 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 yip. And Scotch was excited to go on his way. Now, the two of them set out, as I mentioned, it was a beautiful September day. Now, Miss Brom, she tethered her horse at Boulder Field and then later made her way to the summit. But it was on the way down from the summit that things began to change. Well, storms began to move in, clouds, and those snow pellets, the hail, so much so that Miss Brom was having a harder and harder time navigating and finding her way down. She was descending through the Trough, which is a rock-strewn gully that descends below timberline. And as the snow began to amount, it obscured the cairns that would have guided her. And so she found herself going way too far down and missing her turn on a night as the wind built more and more ferocious. Now, the very first search party went out that evening and they turned back. They said, we could not make our way above timberline. It was so dangerous. The wind was just ferocious, knocking us, pounding. Then myself and Carl Piltz and William Copper, well, the three of us set out as the second search party. Now, it was just as the first party described. Now, ferocious, the wind knocking. We brought our lanterns, but they were so often extinguished that we would have to stop and try to relight them and seek shelter. The only way that we could communicate with one another were through signals because our voices were drowned out by the sounds of that hurricane-like wind. But we tried and tried. Now, after midnight, we had made our way to timberline, but we could not go much further. We sheltered ourselves in a cove, and it was there at Boulderfield that I did see a horse. It was Miss Brom's horse dragging its picket rope behind itself. It had found itself a place to take shelter in a cove. Well, we carried on and essentially had to wait until daybreak to begin the further efforts in our search. And at daybreak, I continued and could see the Glacier Gorge area, and it was at daybreak that I saw, well, I managed to hear what I thought was a dog yipping in the distance. And it was there in some gravel and sand that I saw a dog's paw print, and I saw a human shoe print. Well, there it was, over an outcropping of rocks. There was Scotch, yipping and calling me forward. I was so glad to see Scotch, that he was well, but what would I find beyond those rocks? And I was able in the distance to give a long signal to the others in my party that we had found something. And in that daybreak light, we found Miss Brome. Now, her lips were blue, and she was shivering, but she was alive. And she smiled a broken, fragile smile. She was much, much too cold to walk, but we helped her, and we lifted Miss Brome onto my horse, and she made that descent with us. And we returned to the Long's Peak Inn that morning at 10:30 a.m. And by noon, she had begun to regain movement of her limbs and was able to limp her way down to lunch and tell the crowd of people that had gathered about her night spent on top of the world in a terrible, terrible storm. Well, that was one of the rescues that had a happy ending, I'm happy to say. And I must say, as I look back on Brother Enos's advice for Miss Brome, those were wise words. And they are wise words for any of you who might be thinking about an excursion up Long's Peak or one of the great peaks in these Rocky Mountains. One is, again, make sure to build up your stamina, work your way up. Try some of the lesser peaks, as they're called, that are just lower in elevation. Nothing demeaning about calling them lesser peaks. Some of them are quite arduous hikes in and of themselves. But build your way up to Long's Peak. And the second bit of advice from Enos that was wise, if you're going to climb Long's Peak, always bring Scotch. Well, I mean, Scotch the dog, of course. What were you thinking? Well, that is Joe Mills' true tale of a rescue on Long's Peak. Now, you heard, of course, in the story a lot about Scotch, and our next tale is from Enos Mills, Joe's brother. And, of course, as some of you may know, the story of Scotch is one of the many books that Enos Mills has written that tells of course, Scotch has had many other adventures along the way, and these are well worth reading. Enos Mills was a prolific writer, and of course he is known for his championing of Rocky Mountain National Park, a place that likely would not have come into being without his devotion and all the years of crisscrossing the country and writing letters. But before and after the effort to create Rocky Mountain National Park, Enos Mills was a naturalist and a writer. And before he went on the campaign for Rocky Mountain National Park, one of his titles, in addition to being the proprietor of the Long's Peak Inn, was that he was, for a time, the official Colorado snow observer. And well, we'll let Enos tell his tale about snow observing and an incident that, well, got him into some difficulty in these Rocky Mountains. Yes, before my many ascents, 254 some ascents of Long's Peak, most of those guided trips, I had the distinction of being Colorado snow observer. And I will tell you that as snow observer, I relished in this role. You see, it didn't seem that anyone wanted the job, but it took me up and down the Continental Divide, seeing plants and wild animals that I never would have seen otherwise. And on one particular day, one of those days where we get those magnificent spring snowstorms, I was out taking pictures on a spring morning, and I was so exhilarated that when I lost my snow glasses, well, I just couldn't stop. I kept taking pictures, and as the day went on, the bright white light of noontide began to take its toll on my eyes. So much so that I was seeing spots before my eyes. I would squint, and it became harder and harder to see, and my eyes began to ache. And by noontide, I realized that I had succumbed to some sort of temporary blindness, snow blindness. I had heard about snow blindness. My goggles, you see, had long been lost after a big mound of snow had pommeled its way over me and tossed those glasses somewhere down the mountainside. But I carried on. Now, I wasn't yet lost. I could still feel the blazes, the cuts in the trees that told me where the trail was. And even after I lost the ability to feel where those blazes were, I navigated and knew which side the trees were on. I knew that the linden pines were on my left, and that was there to the south-facing slope, and on the north-facing slope were the Engelmann spruces on my right. So as long as I could feel the trees, and for a while I could still continue to feel the moss and the lichens that told me which direction the sun must be shining on these plants and rocks. Well, I called out, surely there must be in this area a prospector's cabin, some miners, some wood choppers. And I would call out, help, help. No one called back. It was still a rather chilly afternoon, and perhaps if they were out, they were being kept sequestered in their cabin, but I continued to call out. Now, I felt I could still continue to navigate until one terrible moment happened. And that was when, from a distance, though I could not see it, I heard the awesome, ominous, terrible, crashing sound from above me. And I found myself getting swept away in this snow slide. It took me with it, and I landed and felt something below me. My legs began to tingle. What was happening? I managed. I was so grateful that I had my walking staff with me, because that was the only thing that could help me lift myself out of this mound of compacted snow and debris and tree limbs and stones that had all been crashing down. And that tingling in my legs, I realized that I had been swept down into an icy pond. And so I managed to get my way out, but then I was so cold and shivering. And somehow I felt in all of this compacted snow and debris and rocks something warm, something not moving, something not giving a sound. And I dared to find my way to that warmth. As I gasped for my own breaths, I realized that another creature had not fared so well. There was a mountain sheep that must have been caught up in this snow slide, and that's the warmth that I was feeling. And so I knew it had died, but its warmth kept me going for a few more moments as my legs continued to shiver. I felt its broken horn, and then I remembered that I had my matches, and I had my hatchet. And though I could not see, I managed with my feeling, I managed that I could cut some limbs and was able to light a fire. Oh, now I knew that it must be getting dark, because it continued to get colder and colder. The sun was going away, but the fire warmed me, and I greeted it until I realized that the heat from the fire was aching my blinded eyes so much so, that they began to ache, and I would take snow and rub the snow over my eyes to hope they would soothe and feel better. Oh, what a night this would be. I could not sleep, of course. During the night, I heard the hoo, hoo, hoo of an owl. Hoo, hoo. And somewhere that must have been morning that was coming on, because when I knew morning was coming, I could hear the dropping of icicles and the chirping of birds. I walked by a tree, and in what must have been carved out by a woodpecker, I disturbed 2 chickadees who fluttered and whistled away. I carried on. I was grateful for the warmth of the sun, but oh, once again, the ache of the heat from the sun burned my eyes. Well, I called out again and again, and sometimes I would smell that sweet smoke of a fire. There was a cabin somewhere in this vicinity, but no one would answer my calls. Well, I continued to carry on, and before that day's end, that second day of my blindness, I managed to find a cabin, a road to a cabin, and I knocked and called out, and there was no one in. But I entered and felt in my desperation that I must do this, and I built a fire. I found several dozen raisins that I had stored in my pocket to sustain me, and that night, though the heat of the fire burned my eyes, I stayed warm. Now that next morning, I was determined to find my way back to that road, and I did. I found the road, and though I had lost one of my snowshoes, I had regained it, and I was able to carry on. And at one point, I slid off of the road into some sort of ditch, but I managed to get my staff and find my way and find the tracks of my snowshoes, so that I was determined if there was a road, it must lead to somewhere. And I carried on until at one point in the road, I felt as if there was a presence watching me. I felt as if perhaps I heard the sounds of breathing. Who was it? I had called out, but there was no answer, but someone was watching me. Who could it be? Could it be someone from the wood chopping or prospecting family with their cabin in the woods? I could only hope. Or could it be someone dangerous, someone who meant me harm? And so I called out, and finally a voice came back, a voice of a child, a little girl, whose voice said to me, "Are you going to stay here tonight?" And that, friends, is how Enos ends his tale called Snow Blinded on the Summit. Well, Enos, of course, had many adventures, and you'll enjoy reading his stories and tales, the story of Scotch among them, lots of great books. He had his hatchet, as he says, and his walking staff here to guide him. Now, there we are. Now, this snow-blinded, you might say, is that a rare occurrence? Well, it wasn't as rare as it might seem. In fact, the next story that I'm going to tell isn't about snow-blinded. It's also about snow, but not necessarily about snow-blindedness. But this next adventurer and figure from our history, well, he also experienced snow-blindedness. He talked about taking a remedy for it and how the eyes would burn. So it's always a reminder to us when you go out on a bright day when the snow's out there, remember your protective eye gear. They maybe didn't have as sophisticated a protective gear in those days as we do now, but nonetheless, it can be very dangerous. So that's a reminder for all of us. Our next figure is actually pictured here with his wife, is Abner Sprague and his wife, Alberta Sprague. And the Spragues had a wonderful lodge in what we know today as Moraine Park. They called it Willow Park then. And they later sold that and opened their second lodge in a place called Glacier Gorge, and not far from a human-made lake that Abner, as a civil engineer, helped design, and that's the Sprague Lake. And many of you have perhaps visited Sprague Lake. Maybe you've also, on that hike, visited a place called Alberta Falls. Alberta Falls is named after Mrs. Sprague, so they have a tremendous history in Rocky Mountain National Park in the days before it became a national park. And so let's let Abner tell what it was like. Now, this is a story about being lost in a blizzard on the Continental Divide, and it's in a chapter of his book called My Pioneer Life, and a chapter called A Pleasant Camping Trip, well, a camping trip pleasant and otherwise. Well, I remember it was September of 1896. Now, Mrs. Sprague and I and Uncle Ford, who was staying with us that summer, well, you see, we all had worked so hard that summer. We were so tired that we needed an excursion. And maybe you all know what it's like when you work so hard all summer long and you just need a getaway. So we planned a trip to Grand Lake. And we went up and over the Continental Divide with our pack horses. Yes, Mrs. Sprague, Uncle Ford, myself. We had, Mrs. Sprague's pony, Queenie, and Bob was Uncle Ford's horse. And we also had this pack animal who joined us. Now, he was an old mule who had been worked so hard by an old prospector and then just left and abandoned. Well, we took care of him, and he served us and joined us on this camping trip. But because of his personality, he had earned the name Ornery Dude. Ornery Dude the Mule. Well, he joined us on this trip. Now, everything went beautifully on that trip to Grand Lake. In fact, I remember sitting there in the lake enjoying the beautiful sun. One day, we had the most beautiful experience on the lake. We were sitting in a boat in the middle of the lake, and a cloud had come over and began to drop large rain droplets. And it managed to form a perfect rainbow from our boat over to the horizon of the mountains. So much so that the most perfect rainbow had been formed, as if we were at the end of that rainbow. That's the kind of experience you can't plan in nature. You just have to be out. And any given day, any given evening is always different. But it was on the way back. Well, even before we left Grand Lake, I had a sleepless night because I sensed the weather was changing. Now, back in those days, we couldn't just turn on the radio and get a weather report. We had to look out and measure the conditions and try to get the best sense we could, see how the animals were behaving. But we set off. We decided that it would be better to get our way back before we got stranded here on the western side. And we set out. Well, wouldn't you know, it wasn't long into that trip that the weather began to turn on us. Well, the snow pellets came down, and then the hail and the wind. Oh, so much so. Now, as long as we could see the trail, we were well. But eventually the snow pellets began to gather and obscure the trail. So much so that I had to use the wind as my guide. And that's when I began to have trouble with that old mule, Ornery Dude. Now, you see, I just knew that trail there was turning and going to the left, but that mule kept pulling to the right. What was wrong with him? Oh, I said, Ornery Dude, this isn't right. You see, I'm the fellow and you're the mule. I'm not supposed to guide you. Come on now, get on the right path here. And we finally got him a-going to the left. But wouldn't you know, that storm came down, doubled down on us, and we reached a point where we couldn't go forward. Now, you might wonder, well, Abner, why didn't you just go back? Well, if we had tried to go back, the animals wouldn't have none of it. Turning around and going back to Grand Lake would have been like trying to walk into a concrete wall. The wind and the sleet just wouldn't make it possible. And we couldn't go forward either. There was a precipice in one direction and huge outcroppings of rocks in the other. There was no way to get around. The only hope was this ledge below us, and if we had any hope of surviving, we would just have to shelter ourselves on this ledge. And that's what we did. Well, I got down there first and stomped out some area where the three of us could spend our night there. And, we had myself and again, Mrs. Sprague and Uncle Ford. Now, poor Uncle Ford, he had a good hat on him, but the wind caught it and it blew it over the mountainside. We tied a bandana over his head just to keep him warm. Now, Mrs. Sprague, as we lowered her down into the shelter, her skirt was completely frozen, just a sheet of ice. and we were all cold and shivering. We looked forward to the moment when we could kind of get together and maybe the warmth of our shared bodies would kind of help unfreeze our clothes a little bit. Now we tethered the animals up there just above where our shelter was and lowered ourselves down. Now, before nightfall, there was a moment when it paused. You know how that happens when you're in a storm and all of a sudden it changes and it's calm? And well, we began to look out and we climbed back out thinking maybe we could go further. And it was at that time there was enough light to tell me where we were. Suddenly I knew where we were, but I also realized the mistake that I had made. But just as suddenly as it became peaceful, the storm came back and doubled down on us. And Uncle Ford and I, Mrs. Sprague, we all sheltered down there for the night. We tried to eat our sandwiches, but without any real water, we couldn't swallow them. We had thoughts, but we kept those mostly to ourselves. I knew Mrs. Sprague didn't think we were going to make it alive that night. Death could come in many ways. Well, it might just come from a ferocious wind. Could we trust this snow shelter we were in? It might come from the animals. What if something were to startle them? They might take off, come charging over the mountain and take us and our shelter down with them. It was a long, sleepless night, listening to the tick-tock of watches and keeping our thoughts to ourselves. And I knew my mistake. I knew my mistake. But we made it till morning. And morning, we began to hear some birds chirping. We began to realize that the storm had broken up enough that we could make our way forward. Now the animals there were sheltered and they had a complete sheet of ice on their torsos. Well, we chipped away some of that ice off our horses and knocked off some of the pounds of ice that was on their ears, and we began to make our way back home. Now, Uncle Ford, he had a brand new pair of overalls that he wore for this trip, and it was easy to find him as he was sliding down our way down the mountain toward home, because if we ever lost sight of Uncle Ford, well, all we had to do was look for that blue dye of snow in the snow that kind of told us where he had slid down. He made the mistake of he was so thirsty that he drank from the cold stream, and he shouldn't have drank all that water, and he was sick as a dog for days, but we all made it back home alive. And you know my mistake? Remember when I told you that that mule kept pulling to the right and I thought the trail went to the left? Well, that was my mistake. Ornery dude, the mule was right. He knew where the trail was. I had been following the wind, not realizing that the wind ever so slightly had shifted, and I had guided us off the trail. But we made it alive. And you might be wondering about Ornery Dude. Well, he didn't make it back with us there to Willow Park. No, he took a different path. You see, somewhere along the way, he met up with some mountain sheep. And maybe he thought he was kin to them, and he was running along with these mountain sheep until they arrived at, and we could see the tracks. He arrived at some precipice where they were able to navigate forward, and he just couldn't quite do it. Well, they said some days later that Ornery Dude made his way back to Grand Lake. So he turned out okay. Well, that was my mistake. I learned to this day, and that's a little wisdom for all of you, that animals have a way of navigating that we humans can never channel. Even with all of our compasses and tools and maps and devices, animals have an inner sense of navigation that I will always, always admire, especially the navigation of that old mule, Ornery Dude. And I'll end this story saying that, well, Mrs. Sprague and I have had over 60 years of marriage now, and looking back on that, well, I suppose it's been a good marriage because if Mrs. Sprague ever had any complaints about me, she at least kept them to herself. And even though she could, even if she wanted to, she could have gone up to her friends and family and said, you know, I married a man who was dumber than a club-footed old mule. She would be right. but she never rubbed that in and never made a big deal of it. Well, that's a little bit of Abner Sprague, who's got his great stories, as I mentioned, in his book, My Pioneer Life, all of his essays, and a little bit about Abner before we wrap up that kind of tells you a bit of his spirit. At the age of 91, Abner was reading in the newspapers that America was getting ready to enter what we now call World War II. Well, Abner, at the age of 91, marched himself and his muzzle-loading rifle down to the enlistment office, and he said, "I'm ready to fight, and tough as nails, and tough as men half my age." Well, they wouldn't enlist him at the age of 91, but it made newspaper headlines all over the country. Abner Sprague, 91, attempts to enlist an army. And we can only think that it was an inspiration for any of those folks who were on the fence about enlisting and thinking, well, if this old fella at age 91 can do it, gosh, maybe I should do my part too. Abner, it's a great, great story. Well, we've heard about animals. This next story, Abner told us about animals and their navigation skills. This next story also has to do with animals. And this is a story of a dangerous encounter that was had by a gentleman named Wyndham Thomas Wyndham Quin, the 4th Earl of Dunraven. He's an Irish earl, born in County Limerick, fascinating life. And, well, the Earl of Dunraven had the wherewithal to pursue one of his passions, which was hunting in the United States. And he came here and even got to be led by great scouts like Texas Jack and Buffalo Bill Cody. And during his hunting excursions, here in Colorado, he had one particular day that was more memorable perhaps than others. Now, let's let the Earl of Dunraven tell his tale. Well, before I had even arrived in the United States, before I had become known as the American Earl, I traveled so much in those United States, I had heard about the American West, and I so sought to see it. Of course, I had been a reporter for the London Daily Telegraph. I had seen Constantinople. I had seen the Holy Land, Rome, Greece. I had been to Paris. I had been to wonderful places, but I wanted to see the American West. I read about the prairies and the grizzly bears and the buffalo and the moose, the ranches and the haciendas. And on my first excursion to the United States, I made it as far as Richmond, Virginia. Yes, not very far inland for someone who is seeking the Wild West, but I came down with a terrible illness. And from that point on future expeditions, I always traveled with my personal physician, Dr. George Henry Kingsley. I am an author, and you might also know that Dr. Kingsley is an author. One of his books is about our hunting excursions in what is now Yellowstone National Park. Hunting in Yellowstone. Yes, I know that there is even a place in Yellowstone called Dunraven Pass that you can seek out if you tour in Yellowstone. Well, as we hunted in these United States, we eventually made our way into the South Platte and Sidney, Nebraska, and Wyoming, and South Park, and ultimately to a place called Estes Park that we heard was teeming with wildlife. Now, the animal that we sought more than any other is an animal you call the elk. But when you refer to this animal as the elk, you do confuse me just a bit, because the elk in Europe is a moose. And the elk and the moose are two completely different animals. That is why I prefer the Native American word, the wapiti. We sought the wapiti. Well, yes, Americans are always changing good English words, it seems. You'll take a grouse and call it a partridge, or a thrush and call it a robin. For some reason, Americanizing of words. But I do love the word wapiti. And it was perhaps the wapiti we were seeking on one afternoon in Estes Park on a hunting excursion. I had come around a magnificent outcropping of rocks when I sensed someone watching me, something watching me. Before I even turned, I could almost feel her breath upon me. And in that instant, in that moment, I turned and saw the most extraordinary, beautiful, and threatening mountain lioness I would ever lay eyes upon. Now, I managed to try to save my life. I managed to get a shot off, but it only pierced her belly a bit, and she continued leaping. I thought in that instant that if I were to die here, at least I would die a noble, glorious death in a beautiful place, doing an activity I love. And as that extraordinary, dangerous animal came upon me, well, what saved me was not my own shot, but another shot that rang out. And it was the shot fired at the mountain lioness by my physician, Dr. Kingsley. It stopped the mountain lioness, and I got myself up. I recall that, as we would usually do in an instant like that, I dusted myself off and brushed myself off and went forward and said something to the effect that, yes, there are dangers in these mountains, aren't there? Yes, yes. And we continued to make our way and proceed with the rest of the day's hunt. But one of the memories that we take with us as we clean our guns and sit by the fire and smoke our pipes and remember both the adventures and the perils of these Rocky Mountains. That is a tale from the Earl of Dunraven. And yes, if you think back on our tales, my goodness, we've had tales of people encountering animals and tremendous changes in the weather that left them lost on the divide. I'll wrap up today with one final story that brings us back to our friend Joe Mills, who started us off. Remember Joe, the football coach and builder of the Crags Lodge adventure and author of his memoirs in a mountain boyhood? Well, in this particular tale, Joe tells the story of what we might call the strangest rescue of all. Well, one night, on a beautiful moonlit night, I was so thrilled to be in the mountains, in a place where I built my cabin, Peaceful Valley, along Cabin Rock, as I called it. And I looked forward to a beautiful evening. The moon was so bright it illuminated the mountainside. And I made my way up to my cabin and sat out in front, eager to be intoxicated by this evening. Why, the moon cast its glow on the stream that it shined like a silver ribbon. I breathed the fresh air, smelled the pines, and I heard in the distance the wonderful yipping of coyotes. Yip, 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 yip. What a glorious night it would be. But it was then that I heard in the distance a call. Someone calling, "Help! Help!" Well, I ran out to see what was going on, and I called back, but there was no response. "Help!" Well, perhaps what could have happened to this individual, and why would they not call back? I knew there were bear traps in the area. That could be one peril that someone had fallen into. And so I got on my boots and I went and I ran and ran and I covered what must have been 3 miles in record time and got to the source where I had originally heard the calling. And there I heard it again, but from another great distance. "Help! Help!" Someone playing a prank on me? I had come to the place, I was calling out, there was no response. I had made it this far, I was determined. Either someone was in peril or they were playing a terrible joke on me. And so I went again in the direction where I heard the cries. And eventually I came up upon the road where I found the source of the cries, and I saw the figure in the distance. It wasn't a phantom, it wasn't a ghost after all. There really was a figure walking in the moonlight, his shadow casting a range. By this time his calls were almost, he was hoarse in voice, he had been calling so long. And so I waited a moment and watched. And I began to make my approach toward this figure who seemed to be safe, seemed to not be in harm, seemed not to be ill. And I made my way, and suddenly as the figure turned, he caught light of me. said, whoa, whoa. He said, whoa, where did you come from? What a question. What a question. Where did I come from? I answered, where did I not come from? I came from every point on the compass to hear your cries, to see what help you needed. Well, he said, well, I said, what are you calling out about? Well, and he said, well, I got lost. Lost? How did you get lost on such a beautiful moonlit night when everything is so well illuminated? And he said, well, I went fishing. I left my camp to go fishing and I couldn't find my way back. Couldn't find your way back? But didn't you just know to follow the road? Well, yeah, I knew to follow the road we're on, but I didn't know which way to go. Didn't know which way to go, but don't you know, can't you see the peak? Long's Peak towering in the distance. It's your marker. Use that as your compass, Long's Peak. By using Long's Peak, you can clearly see, and I had seen a tent. You can clearly see that your encampment is off to the east. Didn't you know to look at the peak? Well, he said, yeah, I saw the peak. Well, why didn't you follow it? Why didn't you use it as your guide? And he said, well, I saw the peak, but I didn't think it was in the right place. The strangest rescue of all, as Joe Mills tells us, but another happy ending. Well, I hope all of you have enjoyed these stories, and let these stories be an inspiration for you as you enjoy the summer reading program. My name, as I mentioned at the top, is Kurtis Kelly, and I am a frequent teller of these stories and a portrayer of these characters. I hope I get to see you in person sometime soon, and you can check out what I do at my website, which is www.characterinfusion.com. That's characterinfusion.com. And again, I want to thank the Clearview Library District for making this program possible. Clearview is one of the best libraries anywhere. Love the Clearview Library. And be sure to check out all of the great happenings and activities as part of the summer reading program and all the great things that go on year-long at your great library. So thank you, Clearview Library District, and thank all of you for taking part and listening to these stories, and I hope to see you down the road soon. May stories, whether you read them, listen to them, read them on the printed page or on your digital device, or whether you read them alone or share them in a read aloud with family, let stories be a part of your summer and your life all year long. Thanks, everyone. I hope to see you in person soon.